Fatima Ibrahim is the co-director of the Green New Deal UK and the driving force behind Green New Deal Rising. He helped organize the 2014 People's Climate March, which brought more than 1 million people onto the street of the world. But what makes Fatima different from most climate voices is not what she has done in the past. It is what she has chosen to do next. And when most movements were asking politicians to act, she decided to go after the politicians themselves, candidate by candidate, selection by selection, building a climate caucus inside the halls of power rather than marching outside them.
In the UK, they say people don't have £240 of if they have a cost that comes up in the month that they didn't expect. Most people actually don't have that money to accommodate. Imagine that in Africa, where many people are below the poverty line, and that is the level of cost of the climate crisis for them. And this is just one example of it. And I was like, I just feel like people don't quite understand that the climate crisis is here, but the real economic and environmental impacts, it's wiping out people's livelihoods.
There's this researcher, I forget her name, Olivia Lazard, something like that. She had this argument around just transition and how, exactly like he said, right? Minerals from the same places are being extracted to create these products that are cleaner and greener, while still, kind of extracting and marginalizing the same groups of people.
Capitalism renews itself again and again, right? And so through the green economy, it will say, hey, climate crisis is a problem. We need to power ourselves differently. But under it, hide the fact that extractivism will still need to happen, and it will happen in the same communities, and that we're at no way in that chain interrogating the price of it or autonomy and decision making.
For that listener who is frustrated with politics, right, who want to do more than recycle or switch energy provider, what is that one thing you can tell them to do for them to be able to contribute to the real climate action beyond the awareness or the change of their lifestyle? Hello, everyone. Welcome again to yet another episode of the podcast. As usual, I remain Toby, and no leave, no transfer. We have Labake on the podcast. How are you, Labake?
Hi, Toby. I am very well, thank you. Excited that spring has popped in. Yeah, really excited.
Yes, I'm excited. Even though I'm a bit cold, but you claim that you're not cold, but we'll leave that for another day.
Yes.
But it's been a great weather so far.
Yes, I agree. And today on the podcast, we have a really exciting guest. We wanted to jump right in because we're really excited for the topic and for our guest that we have on. Toby's going to tell us who we have on the podcast today.
Yes. So, you see, the climate is not going to be saved by awareness. It's going to be saved by power. 1 million people on the streets, agreement signed, targets set, pledges made, and yet the UK government moved closer to opening 2 new North Sea oil fields. A Labour Chancellor publicly broke from our own Energy Secretary. A backbench revolt is growing inside. So the question is not whether the climate movement has tried. The question is whether trying is enough. And today, we'll speak to someone who have decided a long time ago that it was not. Fatima Ibrahim is the co-director of the Green New Deal UK and the driving force behind Green New Deal Rising. He helped organize the 2014 People's Climate March, which brought more than 1 million people onto the street of the world. She has campaigned as Abbas at the WeMove.eu, spent years building the UK Youth Climate Coalition, and in 2020, she won the Global Citizen UK Hero Prize. But what makes Fatima different from most climate voices is not what she has done in the past. It is what she has chosen to do next. And when most movements were asking politicians to act, she decided to go after the politicians themselves, candidate by candidate, selection by selection, building a climate caucus inside the halls of power rather than marching outside them. And today, on one of the most consequential weeks for UK climate politics in recent memory, we are so honored to have on the podcast Fatima Ibrahim. Welcome on the podcast, Fatima.
Hi, Toby. Hi, Labake. Thank you so much for having me. And excited, to be talking about this at this, critical juncture. I think both for the UK and the world in lots of regards, actually, but that are all super interconnected. And at the center of it is power.
Awesome. So Fatima, let's start at the beginning, right? You've been at this for a very long time. the People's Climate March, here's with the UK Climate Action, others, and now you're leading the Green New Deal Rising. What first drew you into climate activism? And what has kept you committed when, as we are seeing in this past week, the political ground keeps shifting?
Yeah, I mean, my story into climate organizing is different to the average organizer in the UK, and by that I mean maybe the average white organizer in the UK. But it's actually not that different to the experiences of people who are a part of, the diaspora or are from communities of color in the UK, which is actually in growing up here, we have experienced marginalization at times, a sort of a marginalization from politics, from power, and the frustration that causes, but also having a kind of sense of like global identity, that our futures are somehow linked to those of other people who are on the margins around the world. And so for me, it was much clearer being, a child of refugees and migrants that actually, I'm here by luck and by chance, and therefore the marginalization, whether it's racism or Islamophobia that I'm facing in the UK, is deeply connected to the wars that were being started in the early 2000s in the Middle East and Iran, and the extraction that's happening in the African continent. And so that's part of my DNA. And so I always felt this kind of, commitment to justice and a orientation towards solidarity. And so given that was my experience growing up, it became very clear to me that if I cared about human rights and I cared about justice, that the biggest threat to those things and to people everywhere was climate crisis, that it was both a symptom of a system that was like plundering both people and planet, but also it would be the biggest multiplier of injustice. And therefore the thing I needed to work on in my lifetime was the climate crisis, and to stop it whichever way we can, but also to support people to weather the impacts of the climate crisis. And that's kind of been my route into it. And so growing up, I didn't really do much climate activism. It was much more justice-based, Palestine solidarity, anti-war stuff that I was seeing on the TV and I was activated by. And then I think as I learned more, it became clear to me that the climate crisis was something that we just needed to act fast on.
I love that. I love that it also touches on the intersectionality of, the climate crisis as well, of, being African and understanding what that means versus, being from the West. And then I wanted to kind of push a little bit on that question. Is that part of what keeps you committed to it? The fact that it's such, in your DNA as the child of migrants in the West, and the justice conversation just keeps changing is not the right word, but advancing, right? It goes from, that to this climate crisis.
Totally. And I think, everyone, no matter what they're working on, faces periods of disillusionment and frustration. And I feel that particularly with UK politics. And I haven't always worked on UK stuff. I would say I'm much more international in my approach and in my work and in my horizons. But I've been doing quite UK focused work in the last, 6 to 7 years. And it's easy to get frustrated with UK politics, where it feels like you're constantly walking in a circle, where you think you've made progress and then you're back at the beginning again. And I think the thing that keeps me in is that I didn't choose to be a part of the climate movement. Like I said, it was both a calling and almost like a demand of who I was. And then therefore, in the same way, I don't have a choice but to keep doing this work. And even if I get frustrated with UK politics, I do think about, where my family's from in East Africa, being like, oh my God, even further away from power, right? And facing the impacts of the climate crisis right now. I went on a trip to Somaliland, where my family's from, in 2017, and they were facing a drought there. And so my family, relative to other people, is middle class and actually has both the resources they need there, but also supported by a family who are in the West. And they were used to, and they actually one of the few, not few families, but one of the families who actually have a water system that's connected, right, to pipes and gets running and flowing water, paid $30 a month for it. But during the drought, they had to get water delivered, right, by trucks. Each delivery was $30 and they needed 2 deliveries a week. So think about going from $30 a month to $60 a week. That is the impact of the climate crisis. Like, yeah, that is the direct impact. And can you imagine, like, I mean, in the UK, they say people don't have £240 of like, if they have a cost that comes up in the month that they didn't expect. Most people actually don't have that money to accommodate. Imagine that in Africa, where many people are below the poverty line, and that is the level of cost of the climate crisis for them. And this is just one example of it. And I was like, I just feel like people don't quite understand that the climate crisis is here, but the real economic and environmental impacts, like it's wiping out people's livelihoods. It's wiping out livestock and their access to food. And so that's one of the things that keeps me in, is like, does it feel like a choice? Because like those who are most impacted by it are even further away from power.
Yeah. And I love that you give that example, because one of the reasons that, we do this podcast is to help people connect the dots. I don't think a lot of people realize how many things are in fact connected to the climate crisis, right? So an average person could have that conversation and think, the lack of good irrigation system or good water system is, a socio-political issue, where it's also very much a climate issue. It's also and I can think of so many conflicts. I'm Nigerian as well. I'm part of the conflict of, the herder-farmer conflicts is also a climate issue. It's also the change in, the soil and change in their grazing patterns and stuff that activates some of these conflicts. And helping people connect the dot through some of these conversations is part of why Toby and I have this podcast, right? To help people see that all these challenges, all these issues that you're seeing in different parts of the world that look different in different parts of the world, because the drought in Africa, as you've mentioned, and the resulting crisis, if you will, from that would look very different in the West. Like a drought looks very different to the kind of produce that they'll have. It might not be the same as water trucks bringing water for you, but it also has an adverse impact on, whatever systems you're used to. So I think that's very interesting. And before we go down the tangent.
No, totally. And again, it's like even further, it's like it's a class issue in the sense that even that example I gave you was of a middle class family that one way or another could absorb that cost, right? And that had running water to begin with. I was speaking to an activist from Uganda who said, you guys in the West talk about transition. We're talking about development, like transition to what? Like we don't even, like a lot of our villages don't even have electricity, and you're talking about how you power your electricity. We don't have it to begin with. So like it just, the language and our concept of like we need a just transition is so far removed from actually the reality of the majority of the world.
Yeah. Completely agree with that. I could go down a tangent on that, but I really believe Africa plays such a strategic role in, the climate conversation as it is. And, a huge part of my work is committed to helping us see that and activate that. But I'll stick to some of the topics we wanted to talk about on the podcast. So Green New Deal Rising, you kind of turn towards electoral organising as a part of the work that you do. Influencing selections, backing candidates, trying to build like a climate caucus in parliament, right? What made you kind of think about political power directly as the next step in the climate movement and climate organizing that you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I'm really glad that you pulled this out of our work, because it's probably been the most experimental and like disruptive. Despite us doing disruptive actions, actually, it's our electoral work that's been the most disruptive type of work, because in the UK, we don't really have a history of social movements and campaigning groups involving themselves in electoralism. And so it's often been the domain of political parties, and social movements stop at the point of trying to influence politics, but not really in the business of changing politics. And that's, for me, what we felt like was the mistake, is that given the timelines and the scale of the issues that we are facing, we can't just accept sort of inheriting a politics that we just have to scream at from the outside or build relationships with, but that really we should be thinking about how do we get better people into politics that understand movements and understand what is at stake and can kind of build political power through electoralism. And that's essentially what we've been doing, is that we have, in the 2024 election, we kind of identified a bunch of candidates that we built relationships with. We built local teams in their constituencies. We did deep canvassing to get them elected, so that we could have an active movement in parliament as well. Because we don't, politicians are, yes, legislators. They make laws, they vote on it, but they help create the weather. They help sort of set what is important because of their platform. They are able to set what is a priority and influence like public salience. And so the more spokespeople and vibrant people we can have in parliament, the more we can kind of engage and mobilize people to believe in politics as a vehicle for change. And so, yeah, we've always had an interesting relationship with politicians where we kind of go, no permanent allies, no permanent foes. Like, we just find people that we can work with and want to campaign for transformative climate action and tackle inequality. And so, yeah, our electoral work has been really exciting. And we were recently involved in a by-election in Manchester, which was the Gorton and Denton by-election, where, a young woman who was a plumber in her community was elected from the Green Party, despite it being a constituency that has almost always been held by the Labour Party. And she beat Labour and Reform in that constituency. And so for us, that was like a really powerful example of hopeful politics can win, and politics that's serious about tackling the crisis at hand. And also a message to the government that unless they're able to meet people's needs and really be bold enough in the actions that they take, that there is a threat, not just to the right of them, which is what they quite often talk about, but also to the left of them.
And I wanted to talk about the Manchester by-election, because it's something I followed closely, because I know that from the Labour side, some people wanted the mayor of Manchester to come up because they believed he was a stronger candidate. And when the lady who ran a very interesting campaign saying she was a plumber, because I remember I saw something on your website that talked about the Green New Right trying to beat politicians who prop up the status quo and elect those who will fight for us. And to see how people accepted the lady was just a phenomenon for me, to see that, okay, now people are beginning to come to understand that, see, we can't keep going to the old guards to bring the change for us. Let's try something. I think that was really encouraging to see that happen from Manchester, and hoping that other people will see the importance of having people who are really ready to fight for them and elect leaders who will do the work that they promised. So that was really great to see. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Absolutely. And we actually met with her in Parliament today, and it was kind of, it's so nice to see someone who is just I said this to her, I was like, the reason you are powerful and why you're worth more than any of them is you're a normal person. You were elected, you represent your community, you are of your community. I was like, don't lose that, because that's actually what gives you your power. And it will give you independent power outside of this place, because you've got that relationship with your community and your movement and movements. And so I think it's those kind of politicians that we want in power, and not people who kind of inherit it, or it's like they feel like it's their birthright to be a politician, or they went to the right school. I think people are starting to see that those people are so disconnected from the experience of the average person in the country, particularly now that we're having a cost of living crisis. Is like that I've been on TV shows with MPs, and I'm kind of like, do we live in the same place? Maybe I need to follow you for a day, because I don't know that you're experiencing the same country that I'm experiencing. Do you ever leave Westminster? Doesn't sound like it.
I think that's true globally, by the way, I should say.
Yeah.
I think, I can give quite a few examples, but I won't. Quite a few examples of politicians and, leaders and executives having conversations that are just so out of touch from the realities of the everyday person. Like, why are you making policy? But yeah.
So your organization places justice at the center of what you guys do, right? And my question is, why is that so essential? And what are the risks if climate solutions are designed without that lens? And because at the moment we're seeing For example, the debate about the energy bills. Who bears the cost of this transition?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that it's interesting because I kind of began to answer this question at the beginning, or in part did, which is I was drawn to climate organizing because of justice. Like I think again, the more you understand why we are where we are, the more you realize actually, like the climate crisis is just a symptom of an unjust system, and therefore you can't fix the climate crisis unless you find, just ways to run our society. And I think I've grown to believe that. I don't know if you guys ever watched the sort of Don't Look Up Netflix, like the film that was made. Yeah. Anyway, so it's interesting because in there they kind of there's a set of characters in there which are kind of the tech elite, right? And they know the climate crisis. I think it wasn't a climate crisis. It might have been a meteor is going to hit the earth or whatever. And so they just decide, you know what, money can save us. We're just going to like fly out of here kind of thing. And so I do believe as time goes on, the tech elite and, political elite will kind of like, oh, let's save ourselves. Like, I don't think, I think they believe in the climate crisis. They just think believe there's a way to protect themselves from it. And so my worry is that those who are already on the margins will be impacted the most. And we have seen that. Like if we see COVID as a small example of the type of crisis the climate crisis is, who was most impacted? Who died? Right? It was those who are frontline workers. It was the elderly. It was the immunocompromised. It was already the vulnerable in our society. And in some ways, you need to see the climate crisis as the same. It's like if we've ordered our society in a way that is like the most important to the least important. And the more money you have, the more important you are, and the less you have, the least important. The climate crisis will impact those who are the least important, right? And I say least important in air quotes because they're not the least important to me and you, but in the way that like society has been created. And so unless you center justice, we just perpetuate the exact same system again and again. And one, I don't believe that will tackle the climate crisis. But two, what we will have is, for example, a transition to the green economy in the UK, but that is plundering countries like Congo and in the South. Like what we will do is we'll go for new resources in the same countries. And we will hurt the same people that we hurt the first time for the Industrial Revolution. And we'll just go again and again and again and again like that. And so that's why, like, even when we talk about the just transition in the UK, one of the things we talk about is maybe we should consume less. Maybe it isn't that everybody gets an electrical vehicle to replace it so that we have the exact same life, but like powered by renewables. But maybe the life we live is excessive because it's taking more from the world than we are due. And actually, if we reduce our consumption, we take less, and maybe we should pay a fair price for it. And those are the ways in which you then make sure that global South communities actually get a fair deal in the new economy and not just more of the same. And that's why I think for Green New Deal, both on a UK level to make sure that our communities in the UK are not impacted, but also on a global level, that like we can't leave justice behind. We can't kind of do away with justice for the sake of pragmatism.
I think you raised a few arguments that I remember reading about quite a while ago, actually. And there's this researcher, I forget her name, Olivia Lazard, something like that. And she had this argument around just transition. And how, exactly like he said, right, the same minerals from the same places are being extracted to create these products that are cleaner and greener, while still, kind of extracting and marginalizing the same groups of people. And it's so interesting because that also links to the next question that I had around linking climate action to issues like wealth inequality, right? And why climate policy debates struggle with economic power or struggle to target it. Because, as you rightly said, which I'll let you answer a little bit more in detail, but as you rightly said, it benefits them, right? It benefits people in high economic places, and the transition or, shift or whatever they want to call it doesn't cover as much as we all think this idea that you're still marginalizing the same people to maintain a standard of living only greener, slightly greener.
Totally. And I think that was one of my biggest problems with the climate movement and why we launched Green New Deal Rising, Green New Deal UK, which was, moving away from climate as an environmental issue, but into an economic one. And that's because at the center of it is actually let's call it what it's capitalism, right? It's extractive capitalism that has caused the climate crisis and also created a system of have and have-nots, and that will continue to keep sort of accumulating, and also transform itself through the green economy, right? I actually wrote my master's dissertation was exactly this, right? Some of the fallacy around the green transition and the impacts it was having on global South communities is that capitalism renews itself again and again, right? And so through the green economy, it will say, hey, climate crisis is a problem. We need to power ourselves differently. But under it, hide the fact that extractivism will still need to happen, and it will happen in the same communities, and that we're at no way in that chain interrogating the price of it or autonomy and decision making, and that is the element of it, the thing that we actually need to undo is power. Where does it sit? Who has it? What decisions are made in whose benefit? And I think an example of it in the UK right now is we are facing an energy crisis because Donald Trump decided to wake up one day and wage a war with Iran, right? And this is not the first time we have kind of experienced some kind of energy or supply crisis or cost of living thing driven by a world leader just deciding one day to do something. But what's happened at the exact same time is the fossil fuel lobby have decided that now is the moment to say, hey, we need more North Sea oil. We need more North Sea oil. Like the UK, if you want to have energy security, let's get more oil from the North Sea. And what's crazy about that is they know, and the government knows, that new North Sea oil wouldn't reduce the bills of people in the UK, that it's not owned by the UK, it's owned by companies who will then sell it on the international market and then sell it back to us at international rates. So but they have one power, which is access to government. Two, they're making crazy profits off the war. The prices are going up and their margins are going up. And so this is why for the last few years, we've seen energy companies record profits year on year. Yet the average person in the UK is struggling to pay their bills because their bills are going up and up. So that's where inequality comes in, which is inequality is basically a system, again, of have and have nots, right? And that energy companies are taking more and more and more. And who is being hit with the cost? It's the working person. And this is why, for us, we've spent the last 3 years campaigning on a wealth tax. And often people are like, but why would a climate organization be campaigning on wealth taxes? But I'm like, we have a government that says it has no money to do the things that we need it to do, including tackle the climate crisis. Yet what we know is there's such a high concentration of wealth that is taxed at a lower rate to work in the UK, and companies who are making record profits. So why, as a democracy, are we letting these people get away with not paying while we're bearing the cost of it, and then also not getting the resilience that we need in return? And so this is where essentially it becomes a money and a power thing, right? Equation is that it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the climate crisis or why the NHS is crumbling or why so many children are in poverty. It comes down to who has the power and who has the money. And we have had an economy that's built on increasingly less and less people having the power and the money, to the extent that actually in a lot of democracies around the world, the governments don't have power. The real power sits with companies who threaten our governments and say, if you tax us, we're going to leave your country. Mm-hmm. That's essentially how our democracies function now, is that our governments that are democratically elected are held hostage by incredibly wealthy people and incredibly wealthy companies, which means they don't act in our interests. So unless we can make them less powerful by taxing them fairly, we're going to constantly find ourselves in this situation where we get into that film, Don't Look Up, where it's the tech giants that are shooting off into space while the rest of us are left on a burning planet.
Hopefully.
You see, on that not COD, right? 'Cause I read a report that there is this public debate between the chancellor and the energy secretary, Uniba. Is that a symbol of exactly what you're trying to describe in terms of even within a government that is committed to this transition, economic argument can still override their climate commitments?
I missed the first part of your question, Toby. Sorry.
No, so I was talking about the new oil deal, right? Where we see the chancellor and the energy secretary at odds against each other. And is that a symbol of exactly the problem you're trying to describe, where we see a government that is committed to the transition is having an economic argument that can still override these climate commitments?
Totally. I mean, I think it's always been a problem in our country that like the Treasury has way too much power, right? Like the Treasury has always been a decade behind the rest of government in terms of like, yes, even under Johnson's reign, right? Like when Boris Johnson was in government, there's a lot of things he committed to and said that Rishi Sunak just didn't provide the money for and said we can't do it. And so it's always through all governments been a kind of struggle with the Treasury. And that's because the Treasury's metrics are different to the rest of government and to the public. And they're just thinking about how do we keep our GDP growing and how do we keep stable and how. But the truth is, GDP has made no one richer in the last 30 years, right? Like even when our GDP has gone up, the kind of quality, what did they say? The living standards in the UK have not gone up since 2008 when the financial crash has happened. That's nearly 20 years of living standards. And if living standards aren't going up, where are they going? They're going down, right? What we are able to access. I mean, we can just see it through our own experiences, I'm sure, which is, I can't access anything that my parents' generation could access, right? I know even people I've worked with who are slightly older than me, right? Earlier in the late 2010s could buy flats that are now 5 times the price when they bought them in 2009. But salaries are not 5 times what they were, right? And so there's just a calculation on the Treasury side that is so far removed and linked to like a very old economic orthodoxy, right? That needs to essentially be smashed entirely. And like one of the things that should be factoring into GDP is actually quality of life index. Like, are people, is there a trickle down, right? GDP is one number, but we should also be looking at the inequality matrix. We should also be looking at living standards, because what's the point of on paper being a rich country if everybody is poor?
I think it also links to the point you made earlier in the conversation about changing politics instead of trying to influence it.
Yeah.
And one of the things I wrote down was kind of updating who is defining and drafting policy, like who are the people in these spaces, right? If we're thinking of the people in Treasury, they are kind of the old guards, as you say. They've been in the same schools, been in the same systems, lived a very similar type of life. And so thinking to them, the 5 times argument that you just made doesn't quite hold because they were part of the people that enjoyed the old systems, right? And so just not trying to influence policy, but actually change the people making the decisions into people that really understand what the realities are now, people that are more integrated. And I think that argument of our generation being, growing up in different parts of the world, being so connected with the diaspora and with other countries, gives us that exposure to also think outside of what we know to be true in the places that we grew up in, which I think is so important to what you're saying, and understanding and improving the quality of life in spaces that you grew up in, and updating, what the metrics that you're measuring, success, if you will, at a country level, at a national level is. But I think that was a very interesting connection that you made to change in politics, which I think more people need to back.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just politics, it's also in our movements, right? Like, let's be honest. This is an entire ecosystem, and government is one. And we know government and the people who go into government don't represent the vast majority of communities in the UK. But then who influences government? There's lots of actors. companies still massively not diverse, social movements still massively not diverse, right? Like, what are the climate policies that we're putting in front of our decision makers, and how justice-based are they? Like, that is being determined by people who also similarly fit into the same class as those in government, right? Which is from, older, middle class, white. And so there's also a problem with the kind of wider ecosystem that I'm a part of, which is there's very few climate or environmental organizations in the UK, very few, and to my mind can only name one right now, that are led by a person of color. And I'm sure if you did the class analysis also, probably very few that are led by working class people. Like, that is a problem. And I notice it in the conversations that I have, that I'm kind of like, oh, you also seem a little bit detached from. And like, some of the communities you're talking about, you're kind of instrumentalizing, right? Like, it sounds good to talk about this community. Do you know anything about them? Do you know what's important to them? It's why it took the climate movement such a long time to talk about economic justice and climate as a symptom rather than just an environmental concern. But now they've gone the complete other way, which is like, oh, we can't talk about climate. We need to talk about cost of living because these communities don't care about climate. And I was like, hello. They do. Like, people are able to hold nuance, and people live nuanced lives that are influenced by so many factors. Like, treat them as full people. But when you're kind of observing from the outside, honestly, like you're in a zoo, you kind of just throw things at the wall and see what works. And like, I think that's also a problem for our movements. Not to be, not to be harsh, but that I think.
No, it's a fair point.
So talking about movement, right? You've worked across internationally, and how do you reconcile the global nature of the crisis with the reality that the power to act on it is still exercised nationally? And does the UK's role actually matter, given that we produce less than 1% of global emissions?
It absolutely matters. It matters, one, because of the UK's role as a historic emitter, and also one of the first country, that kind of led the Industrial Revolution. It also matters because our companies are all over the world extracting, UK companies. It matters because we are a financial center of the world. So we set up much of the financial systems that kind of, that govern, the fossil fuel economy. We also actually are a legal center for the world. So a lot of the kind of cases that are being adjudicated, and like, whether it's Shell in Nigeria, whatever, like, those are actually UK laws and courts are used. And so there's so many ways in which the UK is relevant and as a powerful entity, let alone the sort of soft power it has. And so I think it's a narrative that works in the UK's best interest to be like, oh, we're an island, we're not a big emitter, but actually the way that the kind of power that they have is far reaching. And so making sure that the UK transitions quickly, but also ensures that it is using all of those other routes to make it easy, whether it's ensuring that like tech transfer happens, free and accessible to the countries that also need to engage in the just transition, to make sure patent laws are sort of amenable to those who want to access green technology and other like there's a lot of things that you can do, including the fact that it's in the G7. So it's also a wealthy country that can contribute to the Green Climate Fund, the Loss and Damage Fund, in bilateral agreements that support countries to transition. And so, the UK is still massively powerful, despite the fact that it is, domestically emitting less. The other truth is, it's while emissions might be going down for European countries, it's in part happening because they're offsetting their emissions to elsewhere. So these countries, the UK in particular, actually produces less. It doesn't make things, it consumes things. And so where are those things made? They're made in China, they're made in India, so like those emissions still exist. They've just been calculated somewhere else. And so I think that's another thing for us to remember. I was on holiday in India the year before last, and I was on some sort of tour, and there was a young Australian on the tour, and he's like, oh, it was so offensive, but he's like, you're a climate activist. It must make you so upset to see all of this sort of landfill and the way that people are living. And I go, oh, yeah, you live in the shop front. This is the factory. Like everything that's made here, you consume, but you get to have the clean shop front, but this is your emissions. this is your waste. So like, I think again, people don't make that connection and realize the impact that they're having on the world.
I think that's such an important connection and point of the relationship when you're thinking about emissions between the producer and the consumer, right? And that's I love that. It's very interesting. I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into that one after our conversation. But my question now is about a little bit about our generation. So organizing the Gen Zs and the millennials. Toby likes to think he's a Gen Z. I am very aware in his wildest dreams. I'm very aware of millennial. But basically, as a generation, and we have this conversation all the time, that our generation, we had overlapping crises, from climate to economic instability to, the tech boom, which some people might not think it's a crisis, but it very much is a crisis. Social inequality and all of these things. How do you think these shared experiences change how we organize and you lead these movements to some of the previous movements?
So in a couple of ways. So we decided when we launched Green New Deal Rising in 2021 and wanted to really focus on organizing young people to do Gen Z and millennials as two generations that essentially have the same experience of life, right? Like that one of perpetual crisis. And I think what makes us different is exactly that, is that it's not that we understand this in theory. It's that we have lived it and that we have always been living it. So when people say to me, oh, like, when did you realize climate change was a problem? I was like, well, it was a problem when I was born. It's the reality I have always lived in, right? And so I think that is different to other generations where they have kind of grown through and seen things appear, whereas it's always just been the lived reality of our generation. And also it means people naturally talk about this. Is like, we don't have to teach intersectionality. Our movements just naturally make the links between all of these things, right? And we'll tell a story of their lives, and it's just like, oh, this is how, the degradation of my community post-austerity links to the climate crisis and links to the housing crisis and links to X, Y, Z. And it's just naturally a part of our experience. And therefore, I think also makes us great advocates and brings moral clarity to this. I mean, when I first started organizing, it was about future generations, and I think it very quickly became, oh no, our generation. It's not just future generations. We will live and we will experience this in our lifetime. And so I mean, now it feels weird to talk about Gen Z and millennials when actually, in many ways, there's another 2 generations younger than Gen Z now. Yes, which is wild to think about. So
I'm not ready for that.
if you're a millennial, I mean, it's so funny because Gen Z love to laugh at millennials and call us old, and I'm like,
you're right there next to us.
I'm sorry. I think my brother is the oldest Gen Z. He's born in 97, and I'm like, he's turning 30 next year. So you guys are not looking too young anymore.
No, which is so interesting because you mentioned the lived experience of it, and I actually feel like that's one of the reasons we're good activists, because there's just so much that we've gone through in our formative years. There's so much that we've had to learn and understand and adapt to that our parents never did and our grandparents' generations never did. And I remember growing up and hearing this thing of, you grow up, you go to school, you buy a house before you're 25, you have the white picket fence. And that's not a reality for most people. There are people in their 40s that can't afford to buy a house, right? And work, every day of their lives. And I think for us, that frustration of living through these experiences and seeing kind of the failed systems that we were promised helps us, develop that empathy and, that advocacy that is needed for these movements. So I think that's really interesting. But there's also apparently a tension between the grassroots climate movements and the corporate-led sustainability efforts. Do you think these worlds are fundamentally at odds, or do you think there's a way they can align?
I mean, my general approach is more, as in I really do believe in an ecosystem of efforts, and that let's throw everything at the wall and be pulling in all directions to move things forward. I think where corporate sustainability becomes challenging is that kind of thing that I spoke about earlier, which is it a guise for renewing capitalism, in the sense that, like, are there companies and sectors that just need to die? Or companies and sectors that we just need to control, or like be very clear. So for example, in my thesis, one of the things I talked about is how the mining industry has completely renewed itself, right? It's like we talk about the end of the fossil fuel system, right? And like getting rid of Shell and the energy companies. But the sector that's done the best job at renewing itself is mining. Because they're like, we need to mine the resources of the future to fuel the energy transition. And I'm like, there's like, or whether there are, companies who are doing corporate sustainability that are actually, fast fashion companies, or are driving, consumption. So you're doing corporate sustainability, but like you're also investing in algorithms that just get people to buy, because inherent in your model is to survive, you need people to buy. And so those things are at odds, which is, to what extent is corporate sustainability just greenwashing, essentially, companies that are counter to the real aim, which is reducing consumption and tackling the climate crisis. And I think that's where it becomes challenging. I'm also a realist, right? Which is like, companies are not going away. And we still are going to buy things and need to buy things. And we need tech companies and all sorts of, organizations to run things. And so if they can be doing better and assessing what role they can be playing to not just tackle the climate crisis, but make sure that the ways in which they're acting are just and that they're taking care of people throughout the supply chain, I think all of those efforts are worthy. But there's always a bit of a challenge, which is why I think movements in corporate sustainability are slightly separate, because their goals are separate and they kind of are working to cut slightly different ends.
So as we come to the end of this conversation, for that listener who is frustrated with politics, right, who want to do more than recycle or switch energy provider, what is that one thing you can tell them to do for them to be able to contribute to the real climate action beyond the awareness or the change of their lifestyle?
So I always say, individual, if you think about it like any good diet, it's 80-20, right? So like 20% of the fight is changing your individual behaviors, but 80 of it is like we're tackling systems, and systems are about power and they're about politics. And so thinking about ways in which you can be building power in your communities and ways in which you can be engaging in politics is so important. And they look completely different, right? For lots of people in our movement, they've decided, this is the first time I know more than one person who's running to be a counselor. I know 15 people that are running to be counselors. And like, that's one of the things young people are doing. But other people are involved in a community allotment group, or a community, are involved in their local council, or work in a food bank. And like, these are ways in which they're kind of building power with their communities, but also thinking about, how are you voting? How are you engaging in protests? What organizations are you supporting? Like, this is where the 80% of your energy needs to be spent, is like, how can I multiply my individual power by being in community with other people, or supporting other people to do stuff, or doing stuff? And then the 20% is thinking about how you can change your life. But the real meat of it is like, we need everybody to thinking about what they can do in terms of building power and engaging in political power.
Awesome. Great conversation. I loved this. Thank you so much for your generosity of knowledge, for really interesting points raised that people should deliberate on. I know that there's quite a few of these things that I'm going to pick up and kind of delve into a little bit deeply myself. So it was awesome to have you on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun chatting.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Fatima. I will just close with this, because this is something we like to do on the podcast, where we like to give our guests their flowers, right? As one of the people who led organizers to the People's Climate March in 2014, 1 million people on the street of the world. We're not doing that from a stage or a platform. We're doing that from ground up. We're building coalitions. We're making calls. We're convincing people that their presence mattered. And most people would have stopped there. Like, that's the live work right there, but you kept it. And what struck me most is that you never let the size of the problem become an excuse for inaction. You've never looked at the complexity and said it was too big, it's too small, or it's too political, I don't want to get involved with it. But you looked at it and said, we need to go deeper into politics. We need to be in that room where power is exercised, not outside it. And I remember us talking about the Global Citizen Prize that you won in 2020, where the Global Citizen Prize called you the UK hero. And I think that that's how to undersells you, because heroes they're often remembered for a single moment, but what you're building is not a moment, it's a movement. And movement outlasts the people who start there. What you've planted, the organizing you've done, the belief that young people can change towards power, the insistence that climate justice and economic justice are the same fight that does not disappear. And on the day where the news is full of a backbench revolt and chancellors breaking from climate commitments, you showed up there and reminded us that none of this is inevitable. That the reason this shift is because people refuse to accept it and they cannot. And so on behalf of our listeners, Fatima, we want to say a very big thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. To know that I was asking myself, what was I doing in 2014? And to see that you led over 1 million people to drive change, that's really remarkable. And I want to say a very big thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for pushing young people to believe that they have a role to play in climate action and climate justice. And I strongly believe that the world will remember you for the actions and the step that you've taken. And definitely your name will be mentioned in many, many conversations around the world. So thank you so much, Fatima. We look forward to the amazing work that you do with the Green New Deal Rising. And to be honest, I know I've had a little conversation of I've heard you speak at the training, but I think that left a very huge mark in my heart. So yes, this is someone who really knows what she's doing. And so thank you for coming on the podcast. I'm very sure that our listeners will find this conversation very engaging and enlightening. And for people who want to follow Fatima's work and support Green New Deal Rising, we'll share your website, your social media on the show notes. So please look out for them, support the movement. And I'm sure that it's something that you'll be proud to do. So thank you so much, Fatima, for coming on the podcast. And we look forward
to you're very kind. Thank you so much.
Celebrating more of the amazing things that you do.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Take care. Until next time. Keep changing the world.